I just spent the last 4 weeks traveling across Europe, from Amsterdam to Tuscany to Madrid to Copenhagen to Nice. And originally, the trip came together because I was invited to two different weddings that happened to be a few weeks apart. So I figured if I was already flying across the Atlantic, I might as well turn it into a longer adventure and finally explore parts of Europe that I had never seen before. I was excited to try new food, immerse myself in the local culture, practice a few languages that I don't get to use very often, and experience what everyday life looked like in each place. But somewhere between all the flights, the train rides, the cafes, and long walks through unfamiliar cities, I realized something. I thought this trip was going to teach me about Europe, but instead, it taught me a lot about myself. Probably the biggest surprise of the trip was that I actually loved traveling alone, which is funny because before the trip, I seriously considered canceling the solo portion altogether. Originally, I thought I was going to be alone for about 2 weeks, 1 week in Madrid and another week in Copenhagen. But then my mom decided to join me in Copenhagen, so I ended up spending 7 days by myself in Madrid and a few days alone in Nice before my boyfriend arrived for the second wedding. And before leaving, I had built solo travel up in my head as this really intimidating thing. I imagined myself sitting alone at restaurants, feeling awkward. I imagined everyone noticing that I was by myself. I imagined getting lonely halfway through the trip and wishing I had someone to share every experience with. And of course, my brain came up with all kinds of unlikely emergency scenarios where I would somehow find myself alone and helpless. And don't get me wrong, I genuinely love traveling with other people. Some of my favorite memories are with my boyfriend, with my mom, and with my friends. But somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that if I wasn't sharing every meal, every museum, and every sunset with someone else, then somehow the experience wouldn't be as meaningful. But actually, the exact opposite happened. I realized that being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. There was something incredibly peaceful about waking up and realizing that for an entire day, every decision belonged to me. If I wanted to spend 3 hours wandering a neighborhood, I could. If I wanted to stop at a cafe because it looked cute, I didn't have to convince anyone else. If I wanted to take a Pilates class or walk through a grocery store or spend an hour people watching in a plaza, I could. And somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like I was traveling by myself. I just felt like I was temporarily living in Madrid. And I think that's what surprised me the most. It wasn't that I suddenly became this fearless solo traveler. It was that I realized how rarely I spent an entire day asking myself one simple question. What do I want to do? Because growing up as the oldest child, I became very used to thinking about everyone else. What does my family want? What would make everyone else happy? And even now, I naturally try to accommodate the people around me. If we're deciding where to eat, I'm thinking about what everyone else is craving. If we are planning the day, I want everyone to enjoy themselves. And I don't think there's anything wrong with being considerate. I actually think it's one of my better qualities. But Madrid reminded me that there's also value in making space for your own preferences. Every morning, I woke up early without worrying about my alarm waking up anyone else. I would go to Pilates, I would grab a pain au chocolat afterwards, I would spend a little time by the pool, then head out to explore a different neighborhood. Some days I wandered through Serrano, other days I spent hours in Parque del Retiro, another afternoon I found myself walking around Justicia with no real destination, and dinner looked different every night too. Sometimes I ordered room service, ridiculously late, sometimes I just kept it simple, and sometimes I took myself out to a nice restaurant. And one thing that made me laugh afterwards was realizing how worried I had been about eating alone. I had literally imagined everyone in the restaurant staring at me, wondering why I was by myself. But in reality, nobody cared. Nobody pointed, nobody laughed, nobody even looked twice. Everyone was busy living their own lives. And maybe that's another lesson I took away from this trip. We are often so worried about being judged that we forget everyone else is usually far too busy thinking about themselves to even notice. Like, seriously, think about it. Have you ever gone out to dinner with your friends, then scanned the restaurant for people eating alone and judged them? Probably not. I know I haven't. In fact, I honestly can't remember a single time I've even noticed someone eating by themselves, let alone thought negatively about them. So, why was I so convinced that everyone in the restaurant would be watching me? I think we often assume other people are paying far more attention to us than they actually are. But the reality is that most people are too busy having their own conversations, enjoying their own meal, or worrying about their own lives to spend much time thinking about a stranger sitting across the room. And although solo travel surprised me in the best way possible, it also made me appreciate something else. As much as I enjoyed having complete freedom over my own schedule for a week in Madrid, I also realized that who you travel with matters just as much as where you go. Because travel has this funny way of stripping away all the comforts and routines of everyday life. You're tired, you're jet lagged, you're navigating unfamiliar places, flights get delayed, someone gets hungry, someone's feet hurt, plans change. Things inevitably go wrong. And I honestly think travel speeds up the process of getting to know someone. You learn very quickly whether they are adaptable or rigid, whether they're generous or self-centered, whether they can laugh when things don't go according to plan, or whether every small inconvenience turns into a crisis. People's true colors really do come out when they travel. And after spending 4 weeks bouncing around Europe with different people, it made me realize just how lucky I am that two of my favorite people to travel with are my mom and my boyfriend. And one thing my mom and my boyfriend have in common is that they're both incredibly adaptable. And I honestly think travel rewards adaptability more than almost anything else. Because no matter how much you plan, something is going to go wrong. Your flight gets delayed. It rains on the one day you plan to spend at the beach. The restaurant you were excited about is fully booked. You accidentally take the wrong train. That's just part of traveling. So I think the best travel companions aren't necessarily the people with the best itineraries. They're the people who know how to pivot. And I know that's rich coming from me because I'm definitely more type A and high maintenance. I like researching restaurants and bookmarking cafes. I like making little lists of neighborhoods that I want to explore. I enjoy planning. But what complements that personality isn't someone who has an even stronger opinion than I do. It's someone who's easygoing enough to say, sure, let's try it. And that's one thing both my mom and my boyfriend are really good at. And furthermore, they're not looking to me to be the keeper of the fun. If I suggest a restaurant and it turns out to be mediocre, we laugh about it and grab dessert somewhere else. If it starts raining, we duck into a museum. If one plan doesn't work out, we make a new one. The trip keeps moving. We keep it moving. And I didn't always appreciate how valuable that was. I've traveled with people who treat every imperfect decision like a personal failure. I remember one trip last year where someone got genuinely upset with me because I picked a restaurant that wasn't very good. And the thing is, I had researched it beforehand, I read reviews, and it was my first time at that restaurant too. It's not like I intentionally chose a bad restaurant. I've also recently traveled with someone who spent days complaining that their shoes weren't comfortable enough for walking, and they wanted to keep going back to the hotel. And I remember thinking, like, we are in Europe. Walking is the experience. Like, at some point, you either buy a more comfortable pair of shoes or you embrace the fact that your feet are going to be tired. Because that's the thing about travel. You're never going to be able to control every variable. The people who seem to enjoy it the most aren't the ones with the perfect itinerary. They're the ones who know how to make the best of whatever happens. They're the ones that are able to keep the good vibes going. And I think spending time with people who were so adaptable started rubbing off on me. Because somewhere during the trip, I noticed another habit I have that I had never really questioned before. I tend to think about decisions as though they are binary. Like almost every decision in my head starts off as which one is the right answer? Should I go to Cafe A or Cafe B? Smoothie or oatmeal for breakfast? Beach day or museum? Solo travel or group travel? I just naturally assume that I have to choose one. But travel kept reminding me that I was asking the wrong questions. For example, when I was in Madrid, there were 2 cafes that I wanted to try, and I was like, why not have breakfast at one and an afternoon coffee at the other? And when I wanted to relax by the pool but also explore the city, I ended up spending the morning reading by the pool and the afternoon wandering. And even when I was with my mom in Copenhagen and my boyfriend in Nice, I still ended up carving out time for myself in the morning for a solo walk and a solo Pilates class. So it wasn't this binary thing of traveling alone or doing everything together. I did both. And that realization stayed with me for the rest of the trip. I started noticing how often I create false either-or choices in my own head. Should I relax or explore? Should I travel alone or with other people? Should I eat healthy or try the local pastries? You get the point. But most of the time, those weren't actually the choices in front of me. I tend to create these constraints for myself. And I know it's obvious, but it kind of reminded me of the yes and philosophy from improv. Like, instead of asking which one is the correct answer, I started asking, is there a version where I can have a little bit of both? Like, yes, this, and this. Maybe I spend the morning by the pool and the afternoon exploring. Maybe I take myself out for breakfast, but meet up with people for dinner. Maybe I will have the smoothie today and come back for the pastry tomorrow. I realized that I didn't have to optimize every decision. I could design my own version. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I do this outside of travel too. Sometimes I assume life is asking me a multiple choice question when it's really asking me to be creative. We spend so much time trying to identify the right path that we forget we're allowed to build one ourselves. This trip reminded me that sometimes the best experiences don't come from making the perfect choice. They come from making a choice, staying flexible, and letting the experience just unfold. And I think that shift started spilling over into the way I traveled too. I stopped trying to travel the way I thought I was supposed to travel and started traveling in a way that genuinely made me happy. I think in the past, I often traveled with friends and family where the mindset was, how can we fit every museum, every landmark, and every hotspot into 4 days? And I definitely understand where they are coming from. Like, if you're only somewhere for a short period of time, of course you want to see as much as you can. But that style of travel usually leaves me feeling like I'm racing from one attraction to the next. I'm constantly surrounded by crowds, waiting in lines, checking the time on my phone, and thinking about the next thing on the itinerary before I've even enjoyed the current one. But this trip felt different. I realized I wasn't really interested in collecting tourist attractions or Instagram worthy pictures anymore. I was interested in collecting ordinary moments. I wanted to know what a Tuesday morning really felt like in Madrid. What neighborhood would I naturally gravitate towards? Which cafe would become my regular spot if I lived here? What grocery store would I shop at? Like, what would my routine look like if I actually lived here for a few months instead of just visiting for a few days? And I think that's when I started connecting with places on a much deeper level. I found myself returning to the same cafe over and over for a cappuccino and a pain au chocolat. By the end of the week, they actually remembered my name and my order. And one thing I really wanted to do was keep my normal routine. So every morning, I went to a local Pilates class. The classes were taught entirely in Spanish, and although I do speak Spanish, I hadn't really used it consistently in quite a while. So that first class was humbling. Half the time I was just watching everyone else and copying their movements because I couldn't process the instructions quickly enough. But I kept going back every morning, and by the end of the week, something really cool happened. My Spanish started to come back to me. I wasn't translating everything in my head anymore. I was following along naturally. I was chatting with the instructor before class. And by the last day, we were even joking around with each other. And that's exactly the kind of travel experience I enjoy. One where I feel like I'm participating in everyday life instead of just observing it. I literally spent hours wandering neighborhoods with no particular destination, noticing the architecture, the parks, the little bakeries that are tucked away on the side streets, and just like the rhythm of everyday life there. And I kept finding myself returning to the same places. The same cafe for my morning coffee, the same streets for my afternoon walks, the same couple of neighborhoods because they just felt comfortable. And after a few days of this, I even stopped relying on Google Maps. Instead of following the little blue dot everywhere, I started orienting myself the way I do at home. I was like, okay, if I head north for a while and then cut back towards the main street, I'll eventually recognize the bakery, then the park, and then I'll know that I'm close to the hotel. And it's such like a small thing, but by the end of the week, I remember feeling like the city was no longer unfamiliar. And I felt that way in every city that I visited. I actually went to a local Pilates class in Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Nice, and they were all taught in different languages. I memorized the route from each hotel I was staying at to each Pilates studio and to each cafe that I liked. And I visited supermarkets and pharmacies in all of these cities just to see how they compared and if the vibe was similar. And I think that's why this trip felt so different from any trip that I had taken before. The places I went really stopped feeling like destinations and started feeling like places I actually understood. I think that's one of the coolest things about traveling. Every place you visit becomes a little less intimidating than it was before. The world starts to feel smaller because you begin to recognize the similarities. People grab coffee before work. They go to a workout in the morning or in the evening. They walk their kids to school. They meet friends for dinner. Everyday life isn't actually that different. But at the same time, the world also feels so much bigger. because every place has its own rhythm, its own culture, its own version of what an ordinary day looks like. And now I'm already thinking about where my next trip would be. Like, what would a day in the life of a Dina look like in Buenos Aires, or in Toronto, or maybe even Tokyo? Okay, that's all I had for today. It's just kind of some loose thoughts I've had while traveling. My name's Dina, and this is Casually Thriving.